Welcome to our video tutorial here on the quadratic formula and complex numbers. We are going to look at two examples. Perhaps you would like to hit pause and try them before we proceed together. Now remember, the first thing we have to do when solving by the quadratic formula is to get everything on one side and a zero on the other side of our equation. Once we do that, and the zero is important, a is the number attached to x squared, b is the entire number attached to x, and c is the constant. And then please remember our formula that x is equal to the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all divided by 2a. So now we simply plug things into that formula. X is equal to the opposite of b, which is the opposite of negative 5, plus or minus the square root of negative 5. Make sure you put a negative in parentheses there when we square it, minus 4 times a times c, all divided by 2 times a. So in this case, x is 5 plus or minus the square root. That's going to be 25, and then we're going to have a negative 8 times 8 is minus 64. We get all divided by 4. Let's clean up inside the square root. 25 minus 64. Oh, what's that going to be? 25 minus 64 is going to be a negative 39. And then we have divided by 4. Now we will split that up into two separate fractions. Please make sure you do that. X is going to be 5/4 plus or minus, and now there isn't a perfect square that divides negative 39, but even if there isn't a perfect square, what we do is we take the square root of the negative 1 and put it separately, because negative 39 is really 39 times a negative 1. And what we saw when we looked at this is that x is then going to be equal to 5/4 plus or minus the square root of 39 all over 4 times I. That would be our final answer, where, don't forget, I is the imaginary number that is the square root of negative 1. So follow this process and you will be able to solve equations that are quadratic in nature using the quadratic formula. Let's move to our second example. Again, we start by getting a 0 on one side, get everything else on the other side, and as we're doing in this problem, I like the x squared to have a positive number attached to it. Once we do this, the a is the number attached to x squared. In this case, it's 1. The b is going to be a negative 3. The c is 13. Again, don't forget that x is equal to the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So let's plug things in. X is going to be, now you can just jump and say positive 3 plus or minus the square root of, please put that negative 3 in parentheses when we square it, minus 4 times a times c, all divided by 2 times a. So in this case, x is 3 plus or minus the square root. We've got 9 minus 4 times 13, 9 minus 52. All of that's going to be divided by 2. So x is 3 plus or minus the square root of negative 43, all divided by 2. We will separate that into the two separate fractions. So x is going to be 3/2 plus or minus the square root of 43 times the square root of negative 1. Remember, anytime we have that negative, we want to put it inside of a square root by itself. And then for our final answer, we're going to say x is 3/2 plus or minus square root of 43 all over 2 times I. Again, I is the square root of negative 1. Now there's one more thing that we're going to put in here to briefly discuss. Let's say that when you were doing a problem, you had something like the square root of negative 20. What we do then is we simplify it like we would have previously. A perfect square that divides 20 is 4. It's 4 times 5. But then to take care of the negative, we'll put the negative 1 in a set of square root as well. 4 times 5 times negative 1 is a negative 20. Square root of 4 is 2. We leave the square root of 5 alone. Square root of negative 1 is I. That would have turned into 2 radical 5i. One more quick example. Let's say we had the square root of negative 98. Same deal. I know that we're going to make this into a square root of negative 1. And then is there a perfect square that divides 98? Yeah, there is. It's 49. Split it up. Square root of 49 is 7. Keep the radical 2 because that can't simplify. And the square root of negative 1 turns into I. So really, not that bad. Make sure you get a 0 on one side when you're using the quadratic formula before you identify a, b, and c. And just watch for how you simplify square roots into a term incorporating an I.